The proceeding will start shortly. 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 The proceeding will start shortly.
Select Vestries Bill. First reading, the Lord Privy Seal.
My Lords, I beg to move that the bill for the better regulating of select vestries be now read a first time.
The question is that the bill be now read a first time. As many as of that opinion will say content. The contrary not content. The contents have it. My Lords, I have to acquaint the House that His Majesty was pleased this morning to make a most gracious speech from the throne to both Houses of Parliament assembled in the House of Lords. Copies of the gracious speech are available in the printed paper office, and I have, for the convenience of the House, arranged for the terms of the gracious speech to be published in the official report.
My Lords, I beg to move that a humble address be presented to His Majesty as follows. Most gracious Sovereign, we, Your Majesty's most dutiful and loyal subjects, the Lords spiritual and temporal in Parliament assembled, beg leave to thank Your Majesty for the most gracious speech which was addressed to both Houses of Parliament. My Lords, it is of course a great honour and privilege to have been asked to propose the humble address to His Majesty this afternoon. It was with a sense of trepidation that my noble friend, Lady Stedman Scott, and I approached the Chief Whip's office, having been asked to come and see the Chief Whip for what had euphemistically been described as a chat. We left knowing we'd been given today's important task, and no relaxation over prorogation for us. The Chief Whip did have the good sense to ask this dour Presbyterian Scot to be the proposer, traditionally the less gag-filled part of the proceeding. Not many jokes there, I guess, was the assessment. It does, of course, allow for my noble friend, Lady Stedman Scott, to pick up any missteps I should make, and also to ensure you all laugh so much as to forget them. I am reminded of the feeling felt when proposing the toast to the lassies at a Burns supper and realising that the razor wit that is the Baroness Goldie was being given the right of reply. Today, my lords, is of course a historic one, as we have received from His Majesty the first King's speech of the new reign. His Majesty spoke movingly this morning of the great loss we all suffered in the passing of Her late Majesty, and I am sure all noble lords, like me, marvelled at the stoic determination which their Majesties and the wider royal family demonstrated in continuing to serve our nation in their time of intense grief. Their Majesties' continued public service is, of course, the very best of legacies from Her late Majesty. Constitutional monarchy provides this country with the stability that so many others crave, and that was why we witnessed the continuity of centuries of tradition this morning. The national pride and excitement around their Majesty's coronation in May provided evidence, if any was needed, of the enormous affection with which they are held. It is also very appropriate to thank Blackrod and all her staff, including our excellent doorkeepers, for once again ensuring this great occasion passed as magnificently as it always does. The occasion of the King's first speech as monarch gave me cause to investigate the first speech from the throne to noble lords of some of his predecessors. It seemed appropriate to begin with George III, not only because we now have the addition to your lordship's house of his excellent biographer, my noble friend Lord Roberts, but because, as the first Hanoverian monarch born in Britain, it would be remiss of me, as a unionist from Scotland, not to repeat his declaration in his first King's speech that he gloried in the name of Britain. It was, however, the continuity of policy problems that face our politicians that struck me as I read these first speeches from the throne. Reshuffles or no shuffles, the issues facing our country remain largely the same. The Chancellor could perhaps take note of the strict economy called for by, rather surprisingly, the non-penny pinching and former Prince Regent George IV, as well as the need to curb inflation in Her late Majesty's first Queen's speech in 1952. For the Home Secretary, William IV looked forward to improving municipal policing. Perhaps some good tips for the Met there, while wishing that nothing interferes with people making known their grievances. Too late for the online safety bill now. But noble lords will, I am sure, take a deep interest in the media, digital and artificial intelligence bills that will come before us. For Michael Gove, leasehold reform was announced in 1952. And I guess many times since. Never an easy topic, not least in your lordship's house. For Kemi Badenoch, Queen Victoria was looking forward to trade deals with Peru and Bolivia. Nothing, though, on CPTPP. Of particular interest to noble lords in 1911 was, of course, George V's government intention to bring forward the Parliament Act. And one suspects House of Lords reform may make the occasional appearance in future speeches from the throne. Nothing too drastic, though. On social issues, the Baronesses Shackleton and Deach will find divorce reform in George VI's First King's speech. Another social issue in Edward VII's first speech, reducing drunkenness in public houses, is perhaps a more difficult topic to deal with. I'm not sure which lucky cabinet member would look after that. Nothing, though, my lords, on smoking and vaping bans in any previous speeches. My lords, we take great pride in our ability to add long-range perspective to our scrutiny. Perhaps we shall require regular fill-ups from historic speeches from the throne in future. Perhaps, to take it a step forward, my lords, in this year before a general election, we should encourage those lucky people, the authors of the much-vaunted document, the manifestos, to merely just crib things from previous speeches from the throne on the basis that policy imperatives never really change. Now, it would be negligent of me, my lords, not to mention that for a party close to my heart, the toiling and disintegrating Scottish National Party, sadly not represented yet in your Lordship's House, there was no Scottish Independence Bill in this morning's gracious speech. Perhaps their ever-changing policy position on the subject has something to do with it. We can look forward to their next contortion, a proposed electoral franchise based on ownership of camper vans, perhaps. My lords, the King's Speech debate which will follow will properly scrutinise a programme for government which will affect every citizen of our great country. The purpose of many of the bills will command support of this House, but we may all have a very occasional disagreement on the detail. As noble lords consider and scrutinise the bills contained, I am positive we will, as Queen Victoria implored the Upper House in her first Queen's speech, treat all bills with true impartiality. How could anyone ever think we would do anything differently? My lords, it gives me great pleasure to beg to move the motion for a humble address to His Majesty.
The question is that a humble address be presented to His Majesty as follows. Most gracious Sovereign, we, your Majesty's most dutiful and loyal subjects, the Lords spiritual and temporal in the Parliament assembled, beg to leave to thank your Majesty for the most gracious speech which your Majesty has addressed to both Houses of Parliament.
My Lords, calm down. It gives me great pleasure to second my noble friend's motion for a humble address. When my noble friend first learned of his nomination for a life peerage, the soon-to-be Baron McInnes of Kilwinning said, "I will do my best to represent Scotland and Edinburgh, to scrutinise legislation and bring what knowledge I have from a Scottish perspective and also experience of working in local government to the House of Lords." I'm sure all noble lords will agree that my noble friend has honoured this pledge and will continue to do so. Yes. I should also like to, at this point, congratulate my noble friend on his eloquent and articulate contribution whilst proposing the motion of the humble address. In preparing for this speech, I came across some very interesting information about my noble friend, which I feel I must share. I discovered that a member of my noble friend's flock refers to him as my darling whip. A whip's job is not easy at times, and you have to be very firm. And all whips across the house work very hard to support us. But I doubt there has ever been a government whip who's been paid such a tribute. My noble friend and I have, in the utmost secrecy, shared some thoughts on our contributions. The advice we were given was not to be controversial or political and to be light-hearted. I'm confident of one of the three. I hope we have all lived up to the advice so far. Up until now, all our communications in the House have happened in the division lobby, where my noble friend has made instructions quite clear to us. Thank you for voting. Please stay. Another vote soon. Watch your messages. Thank you. The whip is now off. Today is an historic occasion. It is His Majesty's first King's Speech, and not surprisingly, His Majesty the King started by paying tribute to Her late Majesty Queen Elizabeth II, who, in contrast to His Majesty the King, delivered no less than 67 Queen's speeches. What is a delight for us all to see is that her legacy of commitment to duty and devotion to service is being carried on seamlessly by His Majesty the King. Yeah. Thinking about the first King's Speech in the new reign has led me to reflect on occasions which have been a first for me. When appointed as a whip and Baroness-in-Waiting, I and others had an audience with the Queen. Our conversation moved very quickly to the condition of the fabric of Parliament. I advised Her Majesty that we had our own firefighters who regularly patrolled the estate and put out fires. Her Majesty advised me then that the room we were sat in had been rewired, and when they pulled up the floorboards, the mice had eaten all the plastic and it was copper on wood. And with typical spontaneity, Her Majesty said, well, neither of us need Guy Fawkes now. This King's Speech also prompts me to relate another first for me, as His Majesty's referred early in his speech to the war in Ukraine and the significant long-term challenges for the United Kingdom. And this brings me to my second of first experiences. In September 2022, as Minister for Women, I had the honour to lead the United Kingdom delegation to the United Nations in New York for the Commission on the Status of Women. Whilst there, I was asked to go and represent the government at the Metropolitan Opera House, who were giving a concert for Ukraine. And as the Ukrainian bass singer sang the Ukrainian national anthem, after he'd finished, he fell into the arms of the conductor. And it was the angst and the distress of the Ukrainian people was absolutely awful. And it was, and still is, one of the most moving experiences of my life. His Majesty's speech started by paying tribute to Her Majesty, the late Queen, followed by the war in Ukraine and the impact of COVID. The impact of COVID on our economy has been immense, and it's right that our government focus its efforts on bringing down inflation and thus easing the cost of living for families. Some noble lords will know that the principal focus of my career has been in helping people of all ages who are trying to enter or re-enter the labour market. And I was, as you would expect, pleased to hear in the King's Speech that the government would, and I quote, help business fund new jobs and investment, and third sector organisations, of which many of us have been part of, have a real role to play in this quest. They understand and are close to the people they are trying to help, and are able to comprehend and understand the real challenges that they face. The King's Speech highlights some of the areas that will help create jobs and support people into employment. My lords, when I did run a third sector organisation, which was helping unemployed people, we used to go out on a Saturday as a management team and speak to unemployed people, and we'd ask them, what are we doing that's no good to you? What are we doing that is good, and what are we not doing that we should? And my lords, I learnt from there that getting a job is one thing, keeping it with numerous obstacles to overcome is another. And at this point, I'm sure I can share with our ecclesiastical colleagues, I was rather hoping the Archbishop would be here today, But you will understand the analogy, won't you, that getting saved is one thing, staying saved another. And so, I am sure that the third sector, faith groups, Job Centre Plus and employers will work together to ensure people can get and keep a job. My Lords, you'll be relieved to know that I do not see it as my role today to comment on every part of the King's speech. We will have the opportunity to contribute and debate this over the next few days. However, there are just a few I will mention which will allow us to help people to enter the labour market and improve their lives. Investment in renewable energy, strengthening education, upskilling people, bringing together technical and academic routes, increasing the number of young people doing high-quality apprenticeships, and to continue to negotiate trade agreements, but I doubt in Peru and Bolivia, and supporting the creative industries and reforming welfare. My Lords, the last point in this King's speech that I was keen to highlight is the expansion of transforming mental health issues and services. And for people who are vulnerable and out of the labour market, mental health is a massive issue for them. And I'm glad that more support will be given. I look forward to the National Health Service and DWP working together on it. But providing those services as a quick fix, they must actually be supported as they go on. And so getting the job's one thing, keeping it is another. My Lords, the King's speech has driven home the message that we live in challenging times, but I firmly believe that the combined expertise of the members of this House will play their part in helping the country to rise to those challenges. I look forward to working with all noble lords to do our utmost to ensure the world becomes a safer place and that our country can overcome the challenges we face for the people we are here to serve.
Yeah. Yeah. My Lords, I beg to move this debate be adjourned until tomorrow. My Lords, as we look ahead to the Government's programme for this, the last session of this Parliament, it's also a time, as we've heard, of reflection. Last year, when Her Majesty the late Queen was unable to be with us, we were looking forward to her Platinum Jubilee celebrations just a few weeks later. And yet, before the year was out, a nation and so many across the world were united in grief and respect as we paid tribute to her extraordinary service. And we as a House were proud that the coronation of King Charles, colleagues from your Lordship's House, representing the four faiths, the Noble Lords Kamal, Noble Lord Singh of Wimbledon, Noble Lord Patel, and my noble friend Baroness Meron, played an important role in that ceremony. We welcomed that our new King made so clear his commitment to all the peoples of our nation and the Commonwealth. Each address is a standalone historic event with its own character, and it leaves its own memories. Today's is the first since 1950 that the King has announced the Government's legislative programme for the year ahead. The last King's speech was in 1951, as we heard, but ill health prevented George VI from attending. The previous year, 1950, saw two King's speeches, one in March and the other at the end of October. Now, at that time, the work to repair Parliament following the Second World War had not been completed. Debates were still taking place in the robing room, apparently in some discomfort, with building work continuing and the sound of pneumatic drills reverberating around the building. Sounds familiar? Viscount Jowett, replying to the debate as Lord Chancellor, was clearly irritated, and he complained, apparently, he said, according to precedent, the door behind me has to be left open, and there was a howling draught blowing around my silk stockings. Well, my lords, these days the silk stockings have gone, but I confirm from these benches that the howling draught remains. Today, it is my pleasure, once again, as Leader of the Opposition, to pay tribute to the proposer and seconder the motion on the humble address. Both speakers today did the House proud. Yeah. It's a great honour to be asked, either as the up-and-coming bright young thing or as the experienced veteran, But I also imagine it's one of the most nerve-wracking experiences any parliamentarian could be asked to undertake. Firstly, there's a insert said with feeling. Firstly, there's a trepidation about the role you are being asked to fill. Now, I've never quite understood at what point in our political lives, or our lives in general, we slide from being the one to watch through to being the wise old sage. But I'm sure a lot of us agree it happens far too quickly. For the 1974 address, the Noble Lord Baroness Burke was on her way to the chamber where she fell and cut her head. As she was whisked away for medical attention, Lord Shepherd, as the new Labour leader of the House, had to find a replacement with just minutes to spare. Lord Fenner Brockway, at the very last moment, had to craft some words in his head as he entered the chamber. A true professional, he delivered an excellent and thoughtful speech, although he did comment that at the age of 86 he could hardly be described as being the up-and-coming. And I have to say, my lords, in some ways today it was hard to tell which was which, as both speakers displayed not only experience and knowledge, but also a fresh and enthusiastic outlook. The Noble Lord McGuinness has showed his wide range of experience and interest, which he was appointed to your Lordship's House 7 years ago. He has considerable experience in the political world from Scotland, with 14 years spent as a councillor in the great city of Edinburgh. And as Boris Johnson's senior advisor in Downing Street on constitutional issues, he must have some fine tales to tell. I'm sure he'd have an enthusiastic publisher for the book. But it's probably to his surprise, as it was to mine, that his long tenure as director of the Scottish Conservative and Unionist Party is listed on the parliamentary website as non-political experience. But having heard his excellent speech today, my lords, I think we look forward to hearing more from him. Now, the noble lady Baroness Stedman Scott is well known to this House, having spent many hours at the dispatch box. Prior to joining your Lordship's House in 2010, just 4 days after me, she spent 30 years with Tomorrow's People's Trust that she spoke about, working her way up to becoming the Chief Executive Officer. In 2005, she was proud to receive the Charity Principal of the Year Award. She informed us in her maiden speech that not only was she a lifelong Conservative, but that she had a distinguished heritage, with 10 of her ancestors being Conservative MPs and 2 being previous members of your Lordship's House. Who knew? She stood down from the government last year, having served as a whip, the Women and Equalities Minister, as well as posts in the Department for Work and Pensions and the Foreign Office. She is known for her kindness to colleagues. And many of us, my lords, when asking questions, appreciated how often she was willing to take issues back to the department. Her speech today was enjoyed by the whole House. Thank you. My lords, this is the 7th time I have responded to the motion in reply to the humble address from the dispatch box on this side of the House. And who knows, could this be my last time? As leader of the opposition, I say. For so many of our citizens, these are challenging and they're worrying times. Our previous debate was held against the backdrop of Putin's invasion of Ukraine. Whilst that terrible war continues, and we remain steadfast in our commitment and support, it has been forced off the headlines by the shocking events in the Middle East. It's just a month ago today since the brutal Hamas attack on Israel, with 1,400 people murdered and over 200 taken hostages, and their families are still not to know their fate. The violence and suffering that's been unleashed is devastating. And as the death toll in Gaza continues to rise, it is clear that humanitarian pause is essential now to ensure that aid gets to those who desperately need it, and the hostages must be released. Over the years, it's been too easy to look away, and there have been tensions, when we just hope that peace will endure. But when it doesn't, it's harder to find a way back and to keep the faith that a lasting peace is possible. But, my lords, we have to hold on to that faith. Saying something is so doesn't make it happen. With so much suffering and violence across the world, our role in working internationally with other countries and institutions for the greater good remains essential. Here at home, last year's coronation was a celebration of faiths coming together. Many faith leaders work in their communities to foster understanding and acceptance of our differences and to celebrate both shared and diverse views. When the world can feel more divided, those that are striving to bridge and heal divisions must be able to rely on our support. And at the same time as we see international conflict, so many here at home are worried about their future for them and their families. The cost of living crisis is felt by almost everyone. For a country to thrive requires good governance with competence, optimism, confidence and vision. And over the past few weeks, there's been that usual intense speculation from experts such as political journalists about the content of the King's speech. But most of those reports were depressingly similar. Little about policy, but that Rishi Sunak would seek to provoke dividing lines with the Labour Party as the last chance to protect a failing government. It would be, it was said, my lords, a manifesto for the next election. So no ambition for the country, but ambition for the Prime Minister to try and keep his job. Listening to the address, my lords, there's little to inspire and give confidence that the government understands the seriousness of the challenges the country faces. But when we look at the bills, I have to say it's just disappointing. Yes, I understand that a football regulator is important. Yes, we all want to see health improved by cutting back on damage caused by smoking. And of course we support the introduction of both Jay's Law and Martin's Law. But where's the overriding ambition? Where's a sense of the scale of reform that's necessary? Where's the vision? Even the Energy Secretary had to concede that the oil and gas bill would do nothing to tackle high energy bills. The much-mooted radical overhaul of transport has been reduced to bills that will deal with driverless buses and unlicensed pedicabs in London. We're being promised tougher sentences. It's only weeks ago that judges were being told not to send offenders to prison because there wasn't any room for them. And there's a commitment to reform the law for leaseholders. Yet apparently it's only some reform for some leaseholders, as the 70% who live in flats are to be excluded. Well, my lords, I wouldn't want to be the minister explaining that one to my noble friend, Lord Kennedy of Southwark. And as we wait to see the detail in the much-delayed Renters Reform Bill, any reversal or delay on no-fault evictions is a betrayal of those renting their homes. And I wouldn't want to be the minister explaining that one to the noble Lord Young of Cookham. But perhaps, my lords, we have a Home Secretary who describes homelessness as a lifestyle choice and wants to ban charities providing tents. We shouldn't be shocked at the government's housing failures. And my lords, where is the long-promised employment bill? Just think of the opportunities that could offer. If we really want to grow our economy, we must recognise that strong and fair rights for those in work is absolutely essential and good for growth. Across the world, we're seeing extreme weather conditions and the impacts of pollution. Reducing emissions and seeking to tackle the climate crisis isn't about making life harder for people, it's about seizing opportunities, the opportunities for new skills, for creation of new jobs, and for investment in the ongoing transition with related industries. So new rights at work should be part of an overall modern industrial strategy where we work with industry in training the next generation in skills needed for the jobs of the future. And our education system, it really does have to be a route where every child, whatever their background, can achieve their potential. Yet when the government says it's going to reform the education system for the long term, what it really means is in the long term, because these proposals are still on the drawing board and it will take 10 years before they can be brought forward. My lords, it doesn't have to be like this. I'm an optimist. Government doesn't have to be about just managing. It doesn't have to be looking to see where an issue can be exploited to maximise votes. Government can and should be a force for good, an innovator, an enabler and an investor. Today, our nation needs policies for national renewal to drive forward our economy, our education system and public services. If Labour were in government today, we would establish a national wealth fund to invest in battery gigafactories and clean steel plants. We would establish a publicly owned GB energy company to improve procurement, to speed up green transition and make us a global leader in clean energy. Our focus would be on security of supply for homes and businesses and to protect consumers from rising prices. And, my lords, we have plans to build 1.5 million homes across the country. Our plans for government will unlock the potential for our country to grow and to thrive. When Labour lost the 2019 election so badly, many thought it would take a decade or a generation to recover. But in the same way as we understood the scale of the change that was needed in our party and delivered it, we understand the scale of the change that's needed for the country. In the same way as we had the ambition to change our party, we get the ambition to change our country. In the other place today, Keir Starmer sets out his commitment to lead a dynamic, mission-driven government that will get Britain building and turbocharge renewal in every community across the country. So, my lords, it's partly about vision and about hope, but it's also about belief. Belief in the potential of our public services, belief in the potential of our industries to invest and transition to the economy of the future, and belief, my lords, that the public deserve better and that we as political leaders can do better than this for them. I beg to move that this debate be adjourned until tomorrow.
The question is that this debate be adjourned until tomorrow.
My Lords, it's a great pleasure to be able to congratulate Lord McInnes on his speech moving the humble address. The noble Lord was a force to be reckoned with in Scottish conservatism, bringing the party to great electoral success. And I'm told by my Scottish colleagues that he did so in part by appropriating Liberal Democrat tactics of community politics. My Lords, this shows what a shrewd and wise person he is. He's widely respected across all parties in Scotland and was famously praised by Lord Darling of Rulanish as a house-trained Tory and a Tory you wouldn't mind having in the house. He sounds to me to be in the wrong party, but in any event, we very much look forward to future contributions in your Lordship's debate. My Lord, Baroness Stedman Scott has brought to the House not only a wealth of experience in the charity field, but also great warmth and transparent honesty. On this side of the House, we always look forward to her answering questions from the dispatch box, because she brilliantly deflected the most fervent criticism with a sympathetic smile and a commitment to take the issue back to the department. We sensed that she sometimes silently agreed with the questioner. And we now look forward to hearing what she really thinks from the backbenchers. My Lords, this is obviously the last King's speech of this government, and it certainly has a tail-end Charlie feel to it. Within a year, the government will be putting its record and its plans to the electorate, and there'll be 5 broad areas against which it will be principally judged. First, the economy. We don't know exactly how the numbers will move over the next 12 months, but we can be pretty certain that we'll go into the election with anemic growth at best, higher inflation than many of our competitors, and as a result, a continuing cost of living squeeze. Mortgage holders will increasingly be paying much higher rates of interest as their fixed-term loans come up for remortgaging. Growth is the only way to ease these pressures. But this is going to require an industrial strategy. It's going to require more private and public sector investment. It's going to require an apprenticeship system that actually works, and trading arrangements with our nearest neighbours which don't make exporting for small businesses prohibitively expensive. The King's speech promises nothing but warm words on all of this. Second, public services, particularly health and social care. We have record backlogs in the NHS, widespread shortages of GPs and dentists, and a social care system which simply can't meet demand. Partly as a result of the pandemic, we also have record numbers of people with mental health problems and an urgent need for enhanced public health interventions to stem the growing tide of preventable illness. The government has at long last produced a workforce plan to address some of these issues, but it lacks urgency and funding for its implementation. And yet again, the government has dodged the pressing issue of how to pay for long-term social care. Third, my lords, the environment. Although the government pays lip service to achieving net zero by 2050, its most recent policy pronouncements make that less rather than more likely. Rowing back on the timing of phasing out petrol and diesel vehicles has dismayed the industry as much as it's dismayed environmental campaigners. Pathetically low levels of installation of heat pumps not only puts us behind virtually every other European country, but makes the decarbonisation of household heating a distant dream rather than an urgent requirement. And the abject failure of the national grid to accommodate new patterns of electricity generation and use is now a national disgrace. The government's response is to make it easier to drill for oil and gas in the North Sea. Despite energy bills being double what they were last year, as the Noble Baroness has already said, the Energy Secretary admitted yesterday morning that this policy will do nothing to cut energy bills, and it will, of course, do nothing to help the switch to renewable energy, insulate our homes, or help the most vulnerable pay their bills while prices remain high. As far as the natural environment is concerned, government attempts to get rid of nutrient neutrality rules and its failure to clamp down on polluting water companies show a depressing lack of concern, to put it very, very mildly. All governments should seek to hand over our precious natural environment in a better state than they found it. This one will abjectly fail to do so. Fourth, international affairs. International crises are often the great unpredictable disruptors which preoccupy our politics. And in this Parliament, Ukraine and now Gaza have done so. My Lords, we've supported the government in its response to Ukraine. And on Gaza, we agree that Israel has the clear right to defend itself against attack. But we're concerned about the impact of its response on the innocent citizens of Gaza. We call for a humanitarian ceasefire and a release of all the hostages. And we call on the government to intensify its diplomatic efforts to bring these about. And there remains the ongoing, highly unsatisfactory relationship with Europe. We always claimed that Brexit would make us poorer, less secure, and less influential. The past couple of years have amply demonstrated this truth. The government has had to be dragged kicking and screaming back into the Horizon programme. Took months to get a more sensible arrangement in Northern Ireland, and has failed to do even the most minimal amount which could be achieved in respect of trade in and freer movement of people, or rather, respect of trade and freer movement of people. And fifth of the great issues facing us is the way the country is run. Of all the shortcomings of this government, arguably the most significant is the damage it's done to our Constitution. Its last manifesto promised a constitutional convention. But instead of serious thinking and measured proposals, we've had a collapse of standards in public life, being daily illuminated by the COVID inquiry. All this has eroded trust in domestic politics to such an extent that recent polling shows that some 60% of young people think we'd be better off if we were run simply by a strong leader and didn't even have to bother with Parliament or elections at all. 60%, my lords. And anybody who's done any canvassing in the past few years has been faced with a growing number of people who have given up on voting altogether and are angry and unrepentant abstainers. Needless to say, there is literally nothing in the King's speech which addresses these crises in our political system. So instead of serious measures to deal with these 5 priority areas, we have a programme of shreds and patches. Some of the proposals we broadly support, for example on renters reform, the football regulator and pensions reform. On some, the government clearly lacks a sense of irony. A rudderless government proposing measures to deal with driverless vehicles. I'm afraid, my lords, it cannot but provoke a smile. But other measures seem to have as their principal purpose to drive a wedge between the parties, and they are likely to lead to a less rather than a more fair and united society. How else could one explain the Home Secretary's desire to criminalise the provision of tents for the homeless? How else could one explain proposals for even longer sentences when our jails are full to bursting point? My lords, the silver lining to this whole King's speech is that it's necessarily the last that will be written by this wretched government. The election next year will give us a chance to replace it with a government that's honest, decent, fair and competent. And the sooner we have this opportunity, the better.
Well done. Well, my lords, the convention is to say that it's always a pleasure to follow the noble Baroness, the Lady Smith of Basildon, the noble Lord Newby. But I have to say, having listened to the noble Lord Newby on this auspicious and very splendid and happy day, it was a bit like being served at the end of one's meal, cold coffee and a soggy souffle. My lords, I think that one ought to, I would like to think that I could say something warmer about the noble Lord's speech, so I will try to do so. I mean, I find it amazing, actually, that after a quarter of a century of trying since I first came to work here, that I've now reached the average age of your lordship's house. And one of the things, actually, about being older and conservative is that one likes things to stay the same. So it actually was deeply reassuring to hear the trenchant criticisms of the government from noble lords opposite. Some things never change. And as a good Conservative, I have to say I look forward to hearing them next year make the same criticisms, perhaps not always in the same terms, but from the same seats that they occupy today. But, my lords, nevertheless, I do like the noble Baroness and the noble Lord. They're not always angry, and they and their colleagues actually make the usual channels on which the operation of this House fundamentally depends, work smoothly and almost always with good humour. And I actually shouldn't forget the noble Earl, the Earl of Kinnoul, honed by 16 generations of Scottish deftness and silken charm. My lords, all those who... you have to watch those ones, my lords. But I sincerely thank them all. And, my lord, speaking of Scottish deafness and charm, how much we did all enjoy the superb speech of my noble friend Lord McInnes of Kilwinning, as we did also that of my noble friend Lady Stedman Scott. Now, my noble friend Lord McInnes recalled, as indeed did His Majesty in his gracious speech, the extraordinary lifelong service of our late beloved Queen Elizabeth, to which the noble Baroness opposite also referred. And it actually seems not so very long ago, my lords, that we gathered here after her loss on that so very poignant day before that empty throne. But experience has a habit of making the extraordinary seem ordinary. And I think this whole House, and we've heard it today, is already steeped in gratitude for the dignity and good humour with which His Majesty has, after what was already over half a century of dedicated public service, taken up his great new responsibilities on behalf of us all. He did our nation proud, my lords, in those memorable first state visits to Germany and France, and now lately Kenya. And I believe we are fortunate in our deeply thoughtful and gracious King. Yeah. Now, my lords, those who don't stray too often into the not content lobby, and I note from last session's statistics that includes the overwhelming preponderance of the independent crossbenchers, will not know that as you come out of that lobby, my noble friend Lord McInnes is standing there, always smiling, telling everyone cheerfully who passes, another vote coming up soon, my lords. Now, given that we lost nearly 70% of the votes in the last session, and a record number of votes in the session before that, I think that stamps my noble friend not as the dour Presbyterian that he described himself, but a sunny and incurable optimist. And we need a bit more of that. Perhaps I could offer some to the Liberal Democrat benches. Turning to my noble friend Lady Stedman Scott, we can all agree, I know, that it's been the great good fortune of this House to have benefited from her profound generosity of heart, her direct sound sense, and her expertise on welfare. Actually, we were all so very sad on the government benches when, for personal reasons, she had to stand down from the Department of Work and Pensions and her other duties. And I believe she's made and will continue to make a real difference to the lives of some of the most vulnerable in society. And for my part, that is surely one of the highest callings of anyone in public service. My noble friend is simply put one of life's good people. And she's one of those people in this House you're always delighted to see heading towards you. I must confess that's not an absolutely universal quality. No, don't tempt me. The whole House will have been moved by the very poignant story she told from her visit to New York last year. And we do, as the noble Baroness opposite also said, think of our friends in Ukraine as we gather today. The government's commitment to Ukraine will remain unwavering. And whenever I say that in this House as your leader, I am fortified by the resolve shared by the whole House, and again we've heard it today, that Putin's foul aggression cannot and must not prevail. And we think also of the victims of the truly barbaric atrocities perpetrated by Hamas against Israel a month ago today, in which at least 14 British nationals were killed, and for which there can be absolutely no justification whatsoever. The government continues to support Israel's right to defend itself in line with international humanitarian law. We must and are also supporting the Palestinian people. They are victims of Hamas too. As the Prime Minister has said, there is no scenario where Hamas can be allowed to control Gaza again. We're working to support British nationals in Gaza and the wider region and to secure the safe return of hostages, and we continue to work with international partners to prevent a destabilising regional escalation. Before I proceed further, may I join others in thanking Blackrod, the doorkeepers and all the staff for the skill with which our historic ceremony was conducted today. And it was good to see it in all its finery once again. And in fact, it's the first time for over 70 years that we've had a king and queen present with full trains. And some thought went into working out the pages, moving the trains and getting the royal couple in and out. And what about a Lord Chancellor walking backwards, my lords? Didn't you just love it? Now, in my first speech on this occasion, let me also thank my predecessor, my noble friend Baroness Evans of Bowes Park. I know she'll be aghast to hear any praise for her, but she was an extraordinary leader of this House for over 6 years, and it's been a hard call to follow her. And I'd like personally and publicly to thank her for her kind and wise advice to me. I thank too my sterling front bench colleagues for their tremendous work and dedication. They do a brilliant job, many of them without remuneration. And I believe it's unacceptable in the 21st century that some of those who serve this House can only do so if they have private means. It does not reflect the dignity of the House or give those who serve our country faithfully their proper due. I have sought ways to overcome this, so far unsuccessfully, but I will continue to try. My Lords, no one can say that the last long 16-month session was a breeze. I'm not a fan of long sessions, my Lords. The appetites of departments, and we could all round up the usual suspects, I'm sure, their appetites all too often level up to fill the time available. Of the near 8,000 amendments your Lordships considered last session, 2,680 made to bills came from the government. That is too many, and I can assure the House that I and my noble friend, the Captain of the Gentlemen at Arms, and how lucky we are to have her, my Lords, do make this point to colleagues. But the House never failed in its duty to scrutinise and revise, though perhaps sometimes we should recall the elected House is not so stupid that it cannot hear our requests for it to think again the first time round. In the midst of it all, we did pass a useful and, yes, improved programme of legislation which will have tangible benefits on the lives of our citizens. Even though, at times, it seemed easier perhaps to row a kayak across the North Sea and storm Kieran than to get a bill to stop the boats through your Lordship's hands. My Lords, there's another important programme of work before us this session. That programme will help us to grow our economy, keep our people safe and promote our national interests. Yes, we will back North Sea oil and gas extraction. Why? To help secure energy security and independence and save hundreds of thousands of jobs. We remain committed to our net zero targets, but we must get there in a prudent and proportionate way. I know it's not the favourite word of some of your Lordships, but we will continue to take advantage of the opportunities afforded by Brexit. Unwanted retained EU law will finally go, and this session we will cement accession to the Comprehensive and Progressive Agreement for Trans-Pacific Partnership, fostering trade and investment with some of the world's fastest growing economies. Public service broadcasting will be safeguarded, and we will repeal Section 40 of the Crime and Courts Act, which would have limited press freedom. We will give the police the tools they need to prevent complex new forms of crime. Now, noble Lords will be aware that a number of bills have already started in the other place and will be carried over. They include a bill to ban public bodies implementing politically motivated boycotts of foreign countries, and a bill to improve the law on rents, to give tenants more security and landlords more control over their properties. There will also be a bill to reform leasehold. Now, I have to say that when that was mentioned in the gracious speech, I peeped out from under the cap of maintenance at the noble Lord Kennedy of Southwark. And not a flicker of a smile on that normally sunny countenance. I do hope that, given his constant, almost daily questions on this subject, we must expect his strong support for leasehold reform. My Lords, as well as carryovers, some of which will arrive before Christmas, there will be 4 Lords starters. These will include the Pedicabs Bill, the Autonomous Vehicles Bill, and the Investigatory Powers Amendment Bill, which will have their second readings this month. I look forward to spirited but constructive debate in the months ahead. I know it could be the last session before a general election, my Lords, and passions flame. But I hope we'll always be mindful of our traditional courtesies. They're part of who we are and why we work here well. And perhaps I may conclude with a personal note, because it's been the privilege of a lifetime to serve this House for over 26 years, first below the salt, and now, in a sort of Gilbert and Sullivan way, with the silver salt cellar of the Lord Privy Seal set before me. Now, it may be a fault in me, my Lords, but I can think of no greater honour than to be asked to lead this House. And it would be the happiest and greatest thing for me if your Lordships were to feel not only that I was skillful in getting terrible government legislation through, but also that I was dutiful in listening to, as terrible as what you say, of course, but also that I was dutiful That I have to put that in case they read the Hansard and they haven't heard the tone. But also that I was dutiful in listening to peers on all sides and helping the whole House to secure the good service and support that makes this a place where we can carry out our unique duties comfortably and well. That this should be a happy place is something that matters very much to me, and I know others are opposite. I wish sometimes, however, that we would focus on the great, if often humdrum work we do, rather than calling out imagined faults and fidgeting about change that no one outside calls for and few would notice. The reality is that because of the historic failure of the procedure of the House of Commons in recent generations to do its legislative work thoroughly, this House recovered from the folly of a challenge to the budget to fill that space and has become a literally indispensable revising chamber. That is our role, my lords, and to do it we need rich diversity, more than we still yet have, including diversity of thought and experience. We need deep expertise, open minds, and that sense of proportion which must always inform our judgments. The last thing we need is a house of political clones told by the media to turn up every day and be judged on how often they speak. If I may, my lords, increasing numbers of your lordships complain to me that sometimes in committee and report some of us speak a little too long and a little too repetitively. I believe we could, with advantage, reinforce some of our older conventions, not only in these respects, but in the way we regard the view of the other House. This House must at some point normally defer to the elected chamber. I'm conscious that it was from this dispatch box that the great Duke of Wellington led an unwilling House to let pass Catholic emancipation in the 1820s, reform the franchise in the 1830s, and usher in free trade in the 1840s. And let's never forget that the Attlee government started with only 16 Labour peers, was outnumbered 10-1 by this side, but went on to secure its reforming programme. By agreement, good practice and convention, my lords, convention. So as we continue to reflect on how best to perform our vital role and carry out our functions in line with our conventions, I will continue to reach out to your lordships across the House where there is potential for reinforcing and building confidence in them. And in my humble submission, my lords, unlike the vaulting ambition of grand reform, this approach is entirely in our hands. I know I have troubled your digestion and agitated your good wine for too long. It's been a great and historic day in the presence of our new king. And so I'll finish by sharing the sunny optimism of my noble friend Lord McInnes. And as that optimist, I say that I trust this serious and ambitious legislative programme, which comes from a government led by a Prime Minister with dedication to the long-term changes Britain needs, will commend itself to a majority of your lordships. I look forward to sharing the work of the next session with you, and it gives me great pleasure to support the motion.
The question is that this debate be adjourned till tomorrow. As many as are of that opinion will say content. Content. The contrary not content. The contents have it. Appointment of the Senior Deputy Speaker, the Lord Privy Seal.
My Lords, I beg to move that Lord Gardner of Kimble be appointed as Senior Deputy Speaker for this session.
The question is that Lord Gardner of Kimble be appointed the Senior Deputy Speaker for this session. As many as are of that opinion will say content. Yes. The contrary not content. The contents have it. Nemine dissentienti.
Yes, of course.
My Lord.